On a stormy morning, a wealthy CEO paused to assist a young girl holding a red umbrella. He never expected her soft words would break his heart and transform his life forever. Edward Harrison wasn't the kind of man who paid attention to the weather. For years, he had traveled between sleek glass buildings, protected by darkened car windows and personal drivers. The outside temperature just a fleeting number on a screen he barely noticed. But that morning, when he chose to walk the final few blocks to his office, the sky unleashed a sudden downpour, as if the rain was determined to prove he was still human, still exposed to something as ordinary as a storm. The first icy drop struck the back of his neck as he passed a shuttered bookstore, soaking through the collar of his custom-made coat. At first, he brushed it off, quickening his pace, certain the rain would ease. Instead, it grew fiercer by the moment, until curtains of water spilled from overhead awnings and pounded the sidewalk in a steady beat. Soon, his hair was matted to his forehead, and the wet had seeped through every layer of his clothes. He told himself it was unimportant. He had meetings lined up, calls timed to the second, and a reputation for never being late or rattled by anything. Yet, as he neared the next corner, something caused him to pause. The street was almost empty, save for a few people crouched under umbrellas. Car headlights gleamed in the rain, turning puddles into a patchwork of pale reflections. He was drenched, and there was no logical reason to stop, but he did. He slipped under the slim overhang of an old stone building and rested against the wall. Rain poured down from the roof in constant streams, splashing over his polished shoes and pooling along the sidewalk's edge. He touched his chest, feeling the soaked fabric sticking to his skin, and tried to recall the last time he'd been caught off guard like this. He couldn't. In a way he couldn't fully explain, it felt almost freeing to be reminded he wasn't as untouchable as he often believed. Minutes passed, and he felt the cold sinking deeper into his bones. He could have summoned a car, but he didn't. He stayed, watching the rain. There was something strangely captivating about how it softened the city's sharp lines, blurring the edges and rinsing the dirt from the pavement. He reflected, not for the first time recently, on how hollow his days had grown, how little any of it meant when the business calls ended, and he returned to his quiet penthouse. He was so absorbed in that thought that he nearly missed the sound of footsteps nearing. They were light and cautious, splashing gently through the puddles, growing closer until he sensed someone standing beside him. He turned his head, expecting to see a hurried worker or a street seller. But it wasn't an adult. It was a young girl, no older than 5. Her brown hair clung to her face in wet curls, and her wide blue eyes shone with a mix of tiredness and courage. She wore a bright yellow raincoat that reached nearly to her feet, and blue jeans soaked dark up to her knees. In her small hands, she held a red umbrella with a broken metal rib sticking out, the fabric drooping under the weight of the rain. For a moment, neither spoke. He realized he must seem odd to her. This tall, drenched man in a costly coat, standing in the cold as if he'd forgotten how to move forward. She blinked up at him, her tiny hands gripping the umbrella's handle tightly. Rain splashed between them, forming a curtain of water that felt like a wall he didn't know how to cross. He opened his mouth to ask where her parents were, if she was lost, but she spoke first, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear. "Take it," she said, holding the umbrella out to him with both hands. "Mama doesn't need it anymore." Her words hit him with a force he couldn't have expected. They sank into his chest, heavier than the rain soaking his skin. For a moment, he could only stare at her, at the serious set of her small jaw, and the way she didn't flinch, even as thunder rumbled far off. He saw her shivering, not from fear, but from the cold. And he knew that no matter how many deals he had closed, no matter how many millions he managed, nothing had ever prepared him for this moment. His fingers wrapped around the wet plastic handle of the umbrella, and he noticed with a jolt that his hand was trembling. In that instant, the rain, the city, and everything he thought he understood about his life faded into the background, leaving only her and the overwhelming truth of her simple gesture. He didn't take the umbrella from her right away. For a moment, he stood frozen, struck by the quiet strength in her voice, by the steady calm of a child offering something precious. Without expecting anything back, the rain poured so heavily now that it splashed onto the toes of her small sneakers, seeping into the thin fabric and making her shiver from the chill. Edward felt a sudden, fierce urge that surprised him, to pull her close, to wrap her in his coat and shield her from the downpour that had already soaked her through. He looked into her wide blue eyes, searching for any hint of fear or doubt. Instead, she met his gaze with a serious calm that seemed beyond her years. Her hands didn't shake as they held the umbrella out to him. He could see how tightly she clutched the handle, her small knuckles pale with effort, as if it was her anchor in a world that had grown too silent around her. Finally, he reached out and took the umbrella, his fingers curling around the damp plastic handle with a care that felt almost sacred. The moment he touched it, she let go, her arms dropping to her sides with a weary finality. For the first time, he noticed how thin her cheeks looked, how deep the shadows under her eyes had grown. This wasn't a child lost for just an hour or two. This was a child who had been alone for much longer. He swallowed, feeling a pang of something indescribable pressing against his chest. He wanted to ask why she was out here alone, why no one had come for her. But instead, what came out was something smaller, softer. The only thing he could say without his voice breaking. "Why doesn't your mama need it anymore?" he asked, keeping his tone as gentle as he could. She raised her chin just enough to meet his eyes. When she spoke, her voice was as soft as before, but it held no doubt. "Because she died," she said, and though her lips trembled on the final word, she didn't look away. She got sick, and then she didn't wake up. His breath caught. He had read about such stories in the news. Children left alone with no one to care for them, but they always seemed like distant tragedies, far from the world he lived in. It was different to hear it in her small voice, to see the raw pain of grief she was too young to fully express. He struggled to find words, but nothing felt right. What comfort could he give her? He was a stranger, a man she'd found standing alone, soaked in his expensive coat, as lost in his own way as she was. "What's your name?" he asked after a pause, desperate to keep her talking, to give her something to hold on to besides the cold and the sorrow. "Emma," she whispered, wrapping her thin arms around herself. Her chin dipped again, and she stared at the puddles forming around her shoes, as if ashamed to have spoken at all. "Emma," he repeated, letting the sound of it settle in his mouth. The name felt small and significant, like a promise he hadn't yet made, but already knew he couldn't break. "Emma," he said again, and this time her eyes lifted slightly, as if she needed to know he truly saw her. He shifted the broken umbrella to one hand and slipped off his coat. It was already soaked, but it was better than nothing. He crouched down to drape it over her narrow shoulders, struck by how tiny she seemed up close. She didn't pull back. She stayed still, only clutching the damp folds of his coat and tugging it closer around her. When he stood, he realized he was trembling hard now, though not from the rain. It was the heavy, certain realization that if he left her here, if he walked away, she would remain standing in the downpour with nowhere to go. He cleared his throat, trying to find a logical next step. But nothing about this felt logical. All he could see was how she gripped his coat like it was the only thing holding her up. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe," he said, his voice breaking slightly. But he kept his eyes on her. "Somewhere warm." She didn't reply, but her small head gave the faintest nod. He wasn't sure if she understood his words, or if she simply had no strength left to object. He reached down, pausing briefly before lifting her into his arms. She was so light, almost weightless. Her wet hair carried a faint scent of shampoo and rain, and she didn't resist or pull away when he held her close. Instead, she rested her head on his shoulder, the top of it fitting perfectly under his jaw as if it was meant to be there. He stepped back into the rain, the broken red umbrella hanging uselessly from his hand. He knew without a doubt that his life, with all its orderly isolation, would never be the same after this moment. Edward hurried along the sidewalk, the rain blurring the world into a haze of gray and white. Each step felt heavier, not because of Emma's slight weight in his arms. She was so small it was like carrying nothing, but because of the quiet way she surrendered to being held. She didn't cling to him or bury her face. She just pressed her cheek against his soaked shirt, as if she had no energy left to feel afraid. He could feel her trembling through his damp clothes, each tiny shiver a reminder of how close she'd come to being lost in the cold. He kept his gaze fixed on the glow of a cafe sign a block away. The place was usually packed in the mornings, filled with workers grabbing coffee before their day. But now, with the rain pouring in sheets, he hoped it would be quieter. When he reached the door, he shifted her higher against his chest and pushed it open, bracing for the inevitable stares. The warm air hit them, carrying the scent of coffee and fresh bread, and he felt Emma tense slightly as the sudden warmth prickled her damp skin. The woman behind the counter looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of them. Edward realized how they must look. A man in a drenched shirt and tailored pants, hair plastered to his face, holding a little girl wrapped in a coat far too big for her. For a moment, he thought she might ask questions, but her voice was calm and straightforward when she spoke. "Take any table you like," she said kindly. "I'll bring a towel and something warm." He nodded, too thankful to trust his voice, and carried Emma to a small booth at the back. He set her on the cushioned bench and knelt to ease the kind, wet coat off her, draping it carefully over a chair to drip onto the tile floor. She sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed somewhere just beyond his shoulder. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him, whether he was just another stranger who would vanish, or if she dared to hope he might stay. The barista returned with a towel and a paper cup of hot chocolate topped with a swirl of cream. She handed the towel to Edward, and he thanked her with a voice that felt rough in his throat. When they were alone again, he unfolded the towel and gently began drying Emma's hair. She didn't pull away, just lowered her head and let him work, her breathing slow and unsteady. When he was done, he pressed the cup of hot chocolate into her hands, wrapping his own around hers for a moment to steady them. "It's warm," he said, trying to offer a smile. "Just take a small sip." She looked up at him for the first time since he'd set her down, her blue eyes tired but not quite as empty. With the slightest nod, she brought the cup to her lips and took a careful sip. Her lips quivered, and for a moment he thought she might cry. But she only swallowed and placed the cup gently on the table. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so faint he barely heard it over the rain hitting the windows. "You don't have to thank me," he said, feeling something in his chest ease at the sound of her voice. "I'm just glad you're safe." She didn't respond, and he didn't push her to. Instead, he sank into the seat across from her, trying to gather his thoughts. The weight of what he'd just done was starting to settle in. He had stepped away from the safety of his routines, the detachment of his structured life, and into a responsibility he didn't fully understand but already knew he couldn't abandon. He looked at Emma again, at how she cradled her hands around the warm paper cup as if it were her most precious possession. Her hair was starting to curl as it dried, soft brown waves framing her thin face. He could see now how exhausted she was, her eyelids drooping despite her efforts to keep them open. "Emma," he said, choosing his words with care. "Do you have anyone you trust? Someone I can call for you?" Her eyes flickered, and for a moment he thought she might answer, but she only shook her head. A slow, weary motion that made her seem older than any child should. "No one," she whispered. The truth of her words hit him like a chill breeze deep in his chest. He could see it in her stance, in how she didn't even glance around to check if anyone was watching. She had stopped hoping for someone to come for her. In that moment, Edward knew with absolute certainty that he had already made his choice. He wasn't going to leave her here to face a future. She was too young to navigate alone. He didn't know how he'd manage or what it would demand of him. But that no longer mattered. He reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers, feeling how tiny and cold her fingers were under his palm. "You're not alone," he said softly. "Not anymore." As she looked up at him, her eyes wide and hesitant, he felt the last pieces of his old life slip away, like the rain fading outside the window. The cafe grew quieter as the rain continued to pour, a steady, muffled roar against the glass. Edward watched Emma sip her hot chocolate in small, careful sips, her thin shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Every now and then, she'd glance at him as if making sure he was still there, then quickly lower her eyes, as if afraid she was somehow wrong for looking. He wished he could find comforting words, something to ease her pain, but nothing felt big enough to bridge the gap of her loss. While she drank, he pulled his phone from his pocket and turned it over in his hands. He knew he should call someone. Social services, the police, maybe a lawyer. Part of him thought that was the sensible thing, the only thing that made sense. But as he looked at Emma, at how her small fingers clutched the paper cup like it was her only shield against the cold, he knew he couldn't bear to hand her over to strangers, to watch her vanish into a system that would reduce her to a case, number, and call it safety. He set the phone down and leaned his elbows on the table, staring at the water streaks on the floor where his coat still dripped. In all his years of building businesses and gathering wealth, he had never pictured himself responsible for a child. He had always thought he was too selfish, too caught up in his own goals. Yet, here he was, unable to look away from the quiet, steady presence of this little girl who had already lost more than most could fathom. A memory came unbidden, one he hadn't recalled in years. Himself, not much older than Emma, standing in a dim hospital as a nurse explained that his mother wouldn't come home. He had felt then just as Emma looked now, small, numb, and alone in a world that had suddenly grown too vast. He remembered how no one had knelt to meet his eyes, how no one had said it wasn't his fault, how no one had offered to stay. That memory, raw and unexpected, settled heavily in his chest. He leaned forward, softening his voice to make it feel like a shared secret rather than a question. "Emma," he said, waiting until she met his gaze, "do you know where your father is?" Her face changed, tightening and closing off. She stared at the table, her hands stilling. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't respond. Then, in a voice so quiet it was nearly lost in the cafe's sounds, she spoke. "He doesn't want me," she whispered. "He left when I was a baby. Mama said he came back when she got sick. He wanted money. He said if she gave him money, he'd sign papers to say I wasn't his anymore." Edward felt his heart tighten with a cold, angry sorrow, as much for his own past as for hers. He kept his face steady, but his hands clenched into fists where she couldn't see. How could anyone look at this child, so brave and heartbreakingly small, and see her as something to trade for a price? He'd met ruthless men in boardrooms, watched them destroy lives without a second thought. But this was different, uglier. He took a slow breath, forcing the anger away. Did he ever come back after that? Emma shook her head, eyes still down. "No," she said. "Just Mama and me." The simplicity of her words, the quiet acceptance in her voice, broke something in him he hadn't known was still whole. He realized he'd been thinking of temporary fixes, keeping her warm, fed, finding someone better suited to take her in. But the thought of sending her away now felt as unthinkable as leaving her in the rain. He reached across the table again, covering her small hand with his. She flinched at first, then stilled, her eyes fixed on where their hands touched. He knew he was making promises he didn't fully grasp, promises that would reshape his life in ways he couldn't predict. But he also knew he couldn't turn away from her. "Emma," he said gently, "I don't know everything yet, but I want you to know something." He waited until her eyes met his, wide and full of questions he didn't know how to answer. You don't have to be afraid that no one will stay. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, neither moved. Then her lower lip trembled, and she carefully set the cup down to avoid spilling it. One large tear rolled down her cheek, then another, until she was crying silently. He didn't think. He stood, moved around the table, and sat beside her on the bench. She turned without hesitation, pressing her face into his chest, her small body shaking with quiet sobs. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the damp warmth of her tears soak through his shirt, and closed his eyes. All he could do was hold her, hoping she could sense the truth in his words. Even if he didn't yet know how to be what she needed, he would not be the one to walk away. When Emma's tears finally calmed into an exhausted stillness, she stayed pressed against Edward's side, as if afraid he might disappear like everyone else. Her hair was damp against his shirt, her breathing uneven, but steadying as her crying eased. He didn't try to move her or tell her to stop. He kept one arm around her shoulders, his hand resting gently on her small back, trying to pour all the steadiness he could into that simple touch. As he sat there, he noticed the rain outside had softened. Though water still tapped lightly at the windows, the world beyond the glass seemed gentler somehow, as if even the city was pausing to breathe. Eventually, she shifted just enough to look up at him. Her face was red and blotchy from crying, but her eyes held something new, something tentative and searching, as if she were trying to decide if she could trust him. He met her gaze steadily, letting her see whatever was in his expression: fatigue, determination, the quiet certainty that no matter how complex this became, he would not leave her to face it alone. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice rough from the strain of the hours and the weight of everything she'd shared. She nodded without speaking. It struck him how readily she answered now, how she no longer seemed to fear his questions might be a trap. That small change felt as significant as any choice he'd made that day. He stood and offered his hand, and she took it with surprising confidence, slipping her fingers into his without pause. Together, they walked to the counter, where the same barista was cleaning the espresso machine. When she looked up and saw them, she gave a warm, understanding smile. Without needing to ask, she started preparing a sandwich and another hot chocolate. Edward pulled out his wallet and paid before she could hand him a receipt, murmuring his thanks in a voice that felt too thin for all he wanted to express. They brought the tray back to their table, and Emma climbed onto the bench again, her hands still shaking slightly as she unwrapped the sandwich. She ate slowly, each bite careful, and he realized she was likely trying to make it last as long as possible. Watching her, he felt a tightness in his chest that wasn't pity, but a fierce protectiveness he hadn't known he could feel. While she ate, he pulled out his phone again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He called the only person he trusted, completely for matters beyond business and numbers: his lawyer and longtime friend, Henry Whitaker. When Henry answered, his warm, steady voice came through, and for the first time that day, Edward felt the tension in his shoulders ease just a bit. He stepped a few feet from the table to keep his voice low, though Emma's eyes followed his every move. He explained everything in calm, clear sentences: where he'd found her, what she'd shared, what she lacked. No family, no resources, no one to claim her. He laid out the facts plainly, letting them speak for themselves. When he finished, there was a long pause. "You know this isn't something you can resolve quickly," Henry said finally, his tone kind but serious as Edward had expected. "If you take her in, even for now, you're making a commitment that will stay with you forever." "I know," Edward said softly, surprised by his own certainty. "But she has no one. I can't walk away from that." Another brief silence followed. Then Henry sighed in that familiar way he did when Edward had already made up his mind. "All right, I'll start the paperwork for emergency guardianship. You'll need to take her somewhere safe tonight. I'll come by first thing tomorrow." "Thank you," Edward said, meaning it more deeply than he could express. He hung up and returned to the table. Emma looked up, her face cautious again, as if bracing for news that she'd have to leave. He sat beside her on the bench and clasped his hands on the table, wanting her to understand. "Emma," he said gently, "I called someone who's going to help us. It means you don't have to go anywhere tonight. You'll come home with me, and tomorrow we'll figure out what's next together." Her brow creased, as if she were grappling with the idea of not being alone. Then slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. In that single word, in the quiet way she accepted his promise, he felt something shift in them both. It wasn't quite trust yet, but it was the start of something just as vital. Hope. He helped her into his coat, still damp but no longer dripping, and picked up the broken red umbrella she'd left against the bench. As they stepped outside, the air smelled fresh and clean, the rain having washed away the city's usual dirt. Emma slipped her hand into his, and he closed his fingers around hers without pause. He knew he was entering a life he hadn't planned, one that would ask more of him than any boardroom ever had. But as they walked toward the car, her small steps keeping pace with his, he also knew nothing had ever felt more essential or right. The drive to Edward's house was quiet, but it wasn't the tense, uncertain silence of the cafe earlier. Emma sat in the back seat, wrapped in his spare wool coat, the collar turned up nearly to her ears. Her damp hair was tucked behind her shoulders, and she kept her eyes on the rain-streaked world passing outside the window. He glanced at her in the mirror every few minutes, more to reassure himself she was still there than because he thought she might try to leave. She didn't look scared, only deeply tired, as if her last bit of energy had been spent when she let herself cry. The farther they drove, the more Edward thought about the strange turn this day had taken. He had woken expecting nothing more than a routine of meetings and carefully planned deals. Now, hours later, he was bringing a child into his home, a child who had no reason to trust any adult would stay. The thought struck him with a pang he couldn't name. It wasn't pity or even guilt, though he felt plenty of that for the comforts he'd taken for granted while children like her went unseen in the city's shadows. It was something simpler, harder to shake. A quiet resolve not to let her down. When they reached the house, he pulled into the garage, shielding them from the faint drizzle still falling across the driveway. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, breathing in the quiet that settled around them. Emma looked at him through the gap between the seats, her eyes wide and serious. She didn't ask where they were or if she was truly allowed to be there. She only waited, her small hands folded in her lap, as if she'd learned her fate was always in someone else's hands. He got out and opened her door. As she stepped down, she looked up at the high garage ceiling, her gaze moving over the shiny car parked nearby and the tidy shelves lined with supplies. He saw her take in every detail with that same alert caution, like someone gathering clues for whatever might come next. Inside, the house was silent and almost too clean. He had always preferred it that way. Orderly, predictable, free of any hint of how empty it truly was. But as he watched Emma step carefully over the threshold, her small sneakers leaving wet marks on the tile, he felt an odd shame at how lifeless it must seem to a child. He closed the door and set his keys quietly in the bowl on the side table. "Would you like to see your room?" he asked, his voice gentler than he intended. Emma glanced up, searching his face as if looking for a hidden catch in the offer. Then she gave a small nod. He led her up the wide staircase, their footsteps echoing softly in the large space. The guest room was simple, a soft bed with fresh linens, a small dresser, an armchair in the corner. When he'd called ahead, the housekeeper had tried to add what a child might need: a folded quilt in soft colors, a small lamp shaped like a moon. It wasn't much, but it was something. He held his breath as Emma stepped inside. She looked around, her eyes resting on the quilt, the lamp, the window overlooking the garden. He half expected her to pull back or say she couldn't stay, but she did neither. She walked to the bed and placed her hand on the blanket, pressing her palm against it as if checking it was real. "This is for me?" she asked, her voice small and disbelieving. "Yes," he said, and though the word was simple, it carried more weight than any promise he'd ever made. "It's yours." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and he realized she'd been bracing for a moment when she'd be told she'd misunderstood, that there was no place for her here. He moved to the closet and opened it, showing her the empty shelves and hangers. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll get you some clothes and anything else you need." She nodded without meeting his eyes, her gaze fixed on the corner where the moon-shaped lamp glowed. "I'll be right down the hall," he added softly. "If you need anything, anything at all, you can come find me." This time, she turned to meet his eyes. For a moment, he thought she might speak again. But she only pressed her lips together and nodded once more. "I'll leave the door open," he said, though she hadn't asked him to. She climbed carefully onto the bed, tucking her legs beneath her, and leaned against the pillow. He thought she might fight sleep, staying awake to listen for footsteps, but her eyelids were already heavy, as if she could no longer hold them up. Edward stepped into the hallway, leaving the door slightly ajar as promised. He paused there, glancing back at the small figure curled on the bed, and felt a deep ache in his chest, something very close to love. He hadn't chosen this or planned for it, but as he turned and walked to his own room, he realized he was thankful, for the first time in years, that something had finally pierced the walls of his loneliness. In that quiet space between two closed doors, he understood that whatever came next, he could never again pretend he was alone in the world. Edward hardly slept that night. He lay in the dark, still dressed on top of the covers, the faint glow of the hallway light seeping under his door. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's small face looking up at him in the rain, her voice echoing those words again and again. "Mama doesn't need it anymore." He had never known a single sentence could linger so heavily. The hours dragged on, each moment filled with thoughts he couldn't silence. He tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing by bringing her here, that he wasn't just acting on some selfish urge to fill the emptiness of his life with a purpose he hadn't earned. But no matter how often he told himself this was about her, about keeping her safe, a part of him wondered if he deserved to be more than a stranger offering temporary refuge. Past midnight, he got up and paced the hallway, stopping outside her door to listen for any sign of distress. All he heard was the steady rhythm of her breathing. That quiet calm eased him more than he expected, and he returned to his room, though sleep still wouldn't come. As the first light of dawn began to soften the horizon, he sat in the chair by the window, watching the sky shift from dark gray to pale silver. At 7 sharp, his phone buzzed with a message from Henry. It was brief and direct. "I'll be there in an hour. You did the right thing." Edward let the phone rest on his knee for a long time before replying, his fingers clumsy as he typed. "Thank you. I hope she believes that too." He set the phone aside and rubbed a hand over his face. He could face deals worth millions without hesitation. But the thought of that little girl waking up scared in his house made him feel unsteady in a way he'd never known. When he heard soft footsteps in the hall, he stood quickly and stepped into the doorway. Emma was standing at the top of the stairs, wearing the same jeans and a borrowed t-shirt that hung almost to her knees. Her hair was messy, her eyes still puffy from crying, but she looked more awake this morning, more like a child who hadn't entirely given up. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she shifted her weight and looked at the floor. "I didn't know if I was allowed to come out," she said, her voice rough with sleep. "You never have to ask permission to leave your room," he said gently, his chest tightening at the thought that she felt she needed to. "You can go anywhere you want." She nodded, her small hands twisting together, and he motioned for her to follow him downstairs. The kitchen was bright with early light, and he pointed to the table already set with toast, sliced fruit, and scrambled eggs. She hesitated at the doorway, eyeing the food with the same cautious care she gave everything else. "It's for you," he said, trying to smile in a way that didn't feel too pushy. "All of it." Emma took a step forward, then another, until she was close enough to pull out a chair. She climbed into it carefully, glancing at him once before picking up a piece of toast and taking a small bite. He busied himself pouring coffee and refilling her glass of juice, anything to avoid watching her too closely. But when he glanced over, he saw her shoulders had relaxed slightly. The simple act of a meal and a place to sit seemed to ease something in her he hadn't realized was still tense. They ate in comfortable silence until the doorbell rang. Emma flinched, her eyes widening with fear, but he raised a calming hand. "It's okay. That's the friend I told you about, Henry." She didn't speak, but she set the toast down, carefully, and watched him cross the foyer. He opened the door to find Henry standing there in a crisp suit, holding a leather briefcase that seemed almost comically formal for the situation. Henry's eyes scanned Edward's face, then moved past him to catch a glimpse of Emma in the kitchen. "You look like you haven't slept," Henry said, his voice low as he stepped inside. "I haven't," Edward admitted. "Come on, I'll introduce you." Emma sat very still as they entered, her hands neatly folded on the table. Her gaze shifted from Henry to Edward, searching for any hint that this was another change I have to prepare for. "Emma," Edward said, kneeling beside her chair to meet her eyes. "This is Henry. He's a lawyer, but he's also my friend. He's going to help us figure out what to do next." Her eyes flicked to Henry, then back to Edward. "Am I going to have to leave?" she asked, her voice so quiet it nearly broke him. "No," Edward said firmly, feeling the strength of his resolve like something solid grounding them both. "Not unless you want to. No one will take you away without asking you first." Henry cleared his throat, his professional calm softening slightly. "He's telling the truth, Emma. We're here to keep you safe, not to make you go anywhere you don't want to." For a long moment, she looked between them, her expression cautious. Then she nodded once, a small gesture, but it felt like a start. Edward stood and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. He could feel how tense she still was, but there was no flinch under his touch, only the fragile beginnings of her trust taking root. As Henry placed his briefcase on the table and began laying out documents, Edward knew the day ahead would be filled with questions, signatures, and explanations he could never have foreseen. But standing there with Emma beside him, he felt steadier than he had any right to feel. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The morning unfolded in a calm, deliberate rhythm that seemed to ease Emma in ways Edward hadn't dared hope. Henry worked carefully through a pile of papers, explaining each form in simple words a child might understand if she was listening, though she stayed mostly silent. Edward watched her from his spot by the kitchen table, noticing how she kept her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the glass of juice before her, as if scared to look up and find this fragile sense of safety was just a dream. Whenever Henry paused for a signature or a nod of agreement, Edward made sure to rest a gentle hand on her shoulder or keep his voice steady and calm, never asking more of her than she could give. As the hours passed, the weight of what they were doing sank deeper into Edward's core. This was no longer a fleeting act, no longer just a kindness offered on a rainy day. Each page he signed, each legal statement Henry set before him, tied him more tightly to a promise he had voiced in the cafe and carried in his heart ever since. "You're not alone, not anymore." He didn't think about the questions that would come later, what his colleagues might say, what the media might uncover if they learned of Emma's situation, or what it might cost his reputation to reshape his life for a child who wasn't his by any traditional measure. In that kitchen, all he could focus on was how small she looked in that big chair, and how much he wanted her to believe she was finally safe. When the paperwork was complete, Henry gathered the documents into his briefcase and stood, his gaze shifting between Edward and Emma with a quiet respect. He hadn't said much beyond what was needed, but there was an understanding between them that didn't require more words. As he reached the door, He paused and looked back. "I'll file everything today," he said. "Emergency guardianship is in place. No one can take her without a court order, and I'll make sure that doesn't happen." Edward nodded, unable to find grand words, and managed only a rough, "Thank you." His voice carried all the things he didn't know how to express. After Henry left, the house grew so quiet that every small sound stood out. The soft tick of the kitchen clock, the creak of the floor. Emma stayed at the table, her hands fidgeting with the hem of the oversized t-shirt she wore. Edward thought of how many mornings she must have spent waiting for the next blow, for kindness to be taken back, for another goodbye to come. He couldn't undo the pain she carried, but he could give her this day without more fear. "Would you like to go outside?" he asked, keeping his tone light, as if offering any child a chance to play. "The rain has stopped." She looked up, her lashes still wet from earlier tears, her lips forming a cautious question. "Outside? Here?" "Yes," he said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "There's a garden. I thought you might want to see it." He waited as she slid carefully off the chair and moved to his side. She didn't take his hand, but she stood close enough that he could feel her presence like a delicate thread linking them. He opened the back door, letting the morning breeze drift in. The air smelled clean, with the sweet scent of wet grass and the faint earthy trace left by the rain. They stepped out together, her small bare feet hesitant on the stone path. He watched as she stopped to touch the leaves along the edge, her fingers grazing the water droplets still clinging to the stems. She didn't speak, but she walked further into the garden without waiting to see if he'd follow. He kept a careful distance, not wanting to hover. In the center of the yard stood a single rose bush that had weathered the winter better than the rest of the garden. Its pale blossoms sagged under the weight of rainwater but held firm. Emma knelt in front of it and reached to cradle one flower in her hand, her thumb gently brushing the soft petal. Edward thought of all the times he'd passed that rose bush without a glance, too caught up in his own plans to care if it survived. Seeing it through her eyes, it felt almost miraculous that something so fragile had endured. She turned her head just enough to look back at him, her blue eyes brighter than he'd seen them yet. "It's pretty," she said, her voice so soft it merged with the breeze. "It is," he agreed, and for a moment, he could almost imagine. This was an ordinary morning, a father and daughter finding something beautiful in their backyard. He walked to her slowly and knelt beside her, their faces level. "Emma," he said, the words carrying a weight as he spoke them. "I know this has all happened so fast. I know you have no reason to trust me yet, but I want you to know something." She turned fully to face him, her expression open in a way that tugged at his heart. "No matter what happens," he said, gently placing his hand over hers where it rested on the rose, "I'm not going to leave you. You never have to wonder about that again." Her lower lip trembled, and for a moment, he thought she might cry. Instead, she did something braver. She let go of the flower and reached for his hand. Her small fingers wrapped around his, as if testing whether he'd pull away. When he didn't, when he only closed his larger hand around hers, she let out a long, shaky breath. In that moment, as they knelt together in the quiet garden with the rain-washed petals brushing their skin, Edward felt the last of his old certainties slip away. He didn't know what their future held, or if he was worthy of the trust she was beginning to offer. But he knew with absolute clarity that he would spend every day proving he meant what he'd said. He would never leave her. Not today. Not ever.